Welcome to the PR Maven Podcast, a podcast all about growing your network and building your brand through traditional and digital networking techniques. I'm Nancy Marshall, the PR Maven and CEO of Marshall Communications. I've been strengthening brands through PR for over 35 years, and now I'm celebrating the success of executives, influencers, business owners, and entrepreneurs from all around the world, all of whom have cultivated their brands and broadened their networks through traditional and digital networking methods. Each week, I interview one of these interesting and influential individuals and provide an opportunity for you, the PR Maven Nation, to gain insights from their strategies and stories. So stay tuned for this week's episode, and thanks for listening. Hello, PR Maven Nation. Welcome to the PR Maven Podcast, episode 74, presented by Marshall Communications, creator of the Marshall Plan 65-Step Strategic Process. For those of you new to the show, I'm your host, Nancy Marshall, the PR Maven and CEO of Marshall Communications. Welcome. This podcast provides my unique perspective on the world of public relations and personal branding, including what I hope will be actionable takeaways. I want to emphasize the importance of enhancing traditional relationship building with today's new technology. Every week, the podcast features interviews with successful industry leaders, top executives, and media personalities from around the globe. This week, we're catching up with Greg Glynn, account supervisor at Marshall Communications and a producer for the PR Maven Podcast, to talk about what it takes to be a great podcast guest. So, Greg, welcome.
Thanks, Nancy. Great to be here.
Greg is the perfect guest for today's episode because in addition to his role as an account supervisor at Marshall Communications, he is also one of the producers for the PR Maven Podcast. In his role, he helps schedule the guests we have on each podcast. Plus, he helps me with media pitching and schedule coordination for me to appear on other popular podcasts around the country. If you are looking to be on more podcasts in 2020 to grow your personal brand, Greg is here today with some really helpful tips on how to make that happen. Greg was on the podcast in 2019, and if you want to learn more about him and his background, be sure to listen to episode 28 of the PR Maven Podcast. So to kick off today's episode, let's dive right into our conversation with Greg about being a great podcast guest. So Greg, if you want to be on a podcast, what would you do?
Yeah, so I think this is something that a lot of people need to think about before they're like, oh gosh, I should be on some podcasts. This would be great for my personal brand. And I think that you have to start with something we would do similar in a Marshall Plan. You'd want to find your target audience of who you're trying to reach with your messages. So if you want to be a podcast guest, you need to focus on your area of expertise, then search for podcasts related to that topic so that then you can share your expertise and be seen as an expert in that area. So much like yourself, Nancy, when we're pitching different podcasts around the country, we're talking about how you're an expert not only obviously in public relations, but marketing as well as personal branding. So you're like a tree that's just growing and you have many branches.
Well, I'm also an expert on bread baking. Don't forget, I was the Connecticut State bread baking champion.
That's another branch. There you go.
In the 4-H club.
Absolutely. And that's a great story. And it's, again, part of why we want to focus on what can you bring to a podcast. And you have to know also the host, right? So you can't just pitch a host and think, oh, I'm going to get along great with them, or, oh, they fit my personality. Versus what I think is great about our podcast is that someone can hear who you are. They need to listen to an episode. You cannot blind pitch a podcast. That doesn't work.
No, it's just like any media pitching. You really need to familiarize yourself with the media outlet, and same with the podcast. You really should familiarize yourself because The PR Maven podcast is not all serious. There's some fun and laughing. And if I have a guest who's like really serious, it's going to be
it's going to be a rough episode.
And it has happened. Those of you who have been listening right along might have noticed.
And that's a really good point. And whenever I pitch you for a podcast, Nancy, and I suggest this to people who are going to try to be on podcast, you have to listen to at least one episode. And one of the things I've also done too is I've listened to like bits and pieces of different episodes, because you could catch somebody on a good day, you could catch somebody on a bad day, and you want to be able to know their personality. And also, here's a really good tip. Find a little segment of the podcast that's unique, that's different. Maybe they talked about elephants out in Africa or some funny topic like the bread baking thing, right? So if someone approached you and said, Nancy, congratulations on being the, bread baking champion in Connecticut with the 4-H club, you'd be like, wow, this person really listened to my podcast and knows what I bring to the table and my humor and all that kind of stuff. It's going to make it so much easier for us to go, wow, this makes sense to have this person on as guest. They clearly are involved, they're engaged. That makes a big difference when you're trying to get onto a podcast. So you've got to know your area of expertise. You've got to know the hosts of the podcast. And you also can't pitch blind like I was talking about earlier, especially if you're basing it on the name of a show. Podcasts are really unique in the fact that the names are not obvious. And if you just think that, how it was built is about a certain topic or anything else like that, you're going to be off on a different world, and you're going to be thinking you're pitching one thing, and they're never going to get back to you. So make sure you don't just base it on the name. You've got to do your research. You can also search for different genres of podcasts. I find that iTunes, Apple Podcast has a really good search feature to try to figure out at least a starting point. I've also in the past Googled what are some of the top marketing podcasts. That's an easy way to start, and then you kind of can go from there.
Well, yeah, getting back to that part about, noticing something that a podcaster has said. Again, the same thing applies with journalists. If you're a pitching journalist and you say, wow, I loved that story that you wrote about, the fires in Australia. And, isn't that a shame that, those fires are happening? And if you point out something that someone has already covered and show that you're paying attention.
Yep. And mention a specific interview or anything like that, I think is really good to try and get, again, your foot in the door. And the other thing that's great too, similar to media pitching, right, is if you share a guest idea with you or someone, be a resource and share that there's a great person they should talk to or have on the podcast. Now you're building your credibility with that person, and they might start to have a relationship with you, and then you can maybe evolve into being a guest. So it's about relationship building, which is a lot of what this podcast is about. So it's important.
Totally. So what should a guest do once they have signed up to be on a podcast?
Yeah. So this one, it's really unique right now because the industry is still growing at a rapid pace. So right now we're seeing a lot of podcasting producers or booking experts. They're using a lot of different platforms from Acuity to Calendly. There's even people that do it old school. So they'll ask you, okay, could this date work? And then they've got to look at their calendar program, or they've got to look literally at their calendar. So in many cases, and we find this with our podcast, is we use Acuity. So once someone wants to, be on the show, we typically would send them an email saying, we'd love to have you be a guest. Then we send them a link. Now that link allows them to go and find the available dates. And those dates are programmed into our scheduling program in Acuity. So once you complete that process, that really gets you in the queue, so to speak. It sets a lot of other things in motion. And it's really important, and this is a way to stand out as a guest, to follow the instructions when someone tells you how to sign up or how to use the program, because the last thing you want to do is start off a relationship with, I couldn't figure this out, I didn't know how to do this, and all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself as a producer for the podcast, we're already having trouble and you're not even on the episode yet, So figuring things out or reading directions is really important.
Well, I know I'm going to be on a podcast tomorrow, and they insisted that I call from a landline, which I will do. Yep. But yeah, those kind of details are important.
And they matter. And, it can be even like we have for the PR Maven podcast, making sure you download the Ringer program if you're not going to be in the studio, rather than if the guest doesn't know that or read the email or look at how to download the app, all of a sudden, now we're an hour before the episode and we're like, do you have the app yet? And then it goes downhill from there. So
right.
It also creates added stress when you don't schedule appropriately or don't schedule yourself. This is another tip for someone scheduling themselves. Don't schedule yourself around another appointment. I really would suggest blocking the day for it, just because you need a clear head. You need to prepare. You need to be mentally ready, whether it's the notes that you're going to prepare or hopefully you've worked on maybe the questions that have been provided in advance, so that you are really focused at the time of that interview. You're only going to probably in most cases get a half hour to an hour on a show. So don't go schedule a physical therapy appointment, 45 minutes or a half hour later. You're going to be thinking about, I got to end this. I got to get to that appointment. And you're going to be stressing about it. And it's actually been proven that when you're stressing about something, your voice changes and your emotions can change and you're not completely there in that interview. And you need to be in the moment. So don't overbook yourself, especially on the day of a podcast.
That's a good lesson for me to learn, because I do tend to overbook myself in general in life. So anyway, that's another topic for another day. So Greg, what will guests need to provide in advance of recording the podcast?
Yeah, this is something, if you're a regular guest of podcast, you probably know this and you probably have it available, and you should. But if you're a regular guest or you're pitching to be on certain shows, I really suggest having what I call a show sheet, which is about you, the guest. And Nancy, you have a really good one that we've based on a lot of different podcast guests that we've had on, where it basically has your bio in one place. It has your headshot. It has the topics that you're able to talk about. And then the host can see, okay, I could talk about this. Ooh, and I could talk about this. Rather than if you just say, I want to be a guest on your show, that's just totally different. So it also allows you to have your background, where you went, to college, maybe some fun facts about you so that they can play off of that. Much like the media, and again, a lot of similarities here, they want something that's interesting. So if they can find out that you are the bread baking champion, so be it. They want to tell stories. I mean, we talk about that with content marketing. They want to tell stories. They want to share a laugh. And that's what podcasts are all about. So in addition to having that show sheet, you also need to have a professional headshot. Now, I'm going to emphasize the word here, professional. We've seen some headshots, and I've seen them on other podcasts, that are not professional. They are not taken with a regular camera. They might be fuzzy. They might be taken in a bar. They might be taken in the middle of the woods.
I love the kind where there's an arm, like there's obviously another person in the shot, and the person has cropped the head, and you can still see part of another person's arm, and you spend half the time like trying to figure out whose body parts belong where. Yeah. The other thing that drives me crazy is when people use headshots from 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when, they might not have had gray hair then, and now they do, or perhaps they might have gained a few pounds. And, then when you actually see the person, it's like, wait a minute, you spend the whole 10 or 15 minutes at least trying to sort out you don't really look like I thought you were going to look. And that has actually happened with the podcast, that we've gotten headshots from people, and then they show up and they're like, oh, you look different.
And it can be awkward.
It's jarring. Yeah. It's really jarring. Yeah.
So really think about getting a professional headshot. If you don't have one, it's really important. It should be at least 2 megabytes so that we can not only use it online, but if we wanted to use it in another way or in a print platform, it would be really important to have that. We just compiled a nice graphic of headshots from our top 10 guests in 2019, and it was really nice. And very grateful that we had nice headshots to use, because if we didn't, one of those would have stood out like a sore thumb. It would have been like Sesame Street. Which one of these doesn't belong?
Yeah, right.
So it's important to make sure you have a professional headshot. And number 3, kind of along with the good content from the show sheet and then the professional headshot, is a well-written bio. And when I say well-written bio, I mean make sure that if it's off of your website that it's going to make sense. Make sure it's written professionally. Make sure someone else could read it and still have it make sense. Also make sure that there's no typos. Make sure that it's up to date. It should not end with recently in 2015. That's just amateur hour. So it's really important to make sure that it's up to date. And the other thing, please, when you fill out a form online, like I was talking about with Acuity, and you're going to be providing a bio, make sure you don't put in, "Oh, I'll email you this later," because that then makes it much more difficult for the producers of that show to have to follow up with you to get the bio. If you don't eventually send it, then we've got to kind of track it down. So it's really important to make sure that you have a well-written bio that you can use over and over again. You may want to also alter it depending on the show that you're on, right? So if you're going to be on a certain show, and Nancy, I'm pitching you for marketing, I'm not going to go necessarily too much into your public relations background. I'm going to talk more about the marketing side. So there's important things when it comes to your bio to make sure you provide that. And I'd also say, make it the length that someone could do the introduction with. So typically in our introduction, Nancy, you get 2 to 3 paragraphs depending on the length. It makes it really easy for you to take that bio and introduce the guest so that you don't have to sit there and try and go and find a bio and figure out if it's updated and all that type of stuff. So bio is really important.
Yes, it is, Greg. Thank you. It's all part of your personal brand.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of like, how important you take your own self and value your own self in the marketplace. And, your professional photo, your professional bio, and tell an interesting story about yourself. You need to differentiate yourself from everyone else who does the same thing that you do.
Absolutely.
So that you're the memorable one.
That's right. People want to remember that episode.
That's why I became the PR Maven.
That's right. And you have a very strong personal brand and a great bio.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Greg. Yeah. So we're going to continue our conversation about how to be a great podcast guest. But first, I wanted to share with you about how you can connect with me about this podcast. We have created the PR Maven Podcast listener line. You can call 207-620-9075 right now to get in touch with me, to ask questions, share feedback or ideas for the podcast, including who you would like to hear on the show as a future guest. I look forward to hearing from you. And when we come back, we'll have more tips, so please stick around. This podcast is all about growing your network in order to strengthen your brand. In my 30-plus year marketing and PR career, I have seen many organizations waste their precious time and money on marketing because they're trying to obtain success without any strategy to achieve their goals. So many organizations and companies suffer from what I call the shiny object syndrome, trying every new fad that comes down the pike. That's why I created the Marshall Plan 15 years ago. We have done over 100 of these plans for clients, helping them to get out of their day-to-day routine to identify their goals, solidify their brand story, focus in on their ideal customer avatar, analyze their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and create a realistic budget and measurement dashboard. We create the Marshall Plan collaboratively with our clients over the course of 3 months. We have a 65-step process to create a highly customized, actionable plan. And it's not like we come in and say, we are the consultants from away and we know everything. Instead, we come in and say, let's sit down at the table with your leadership team and we'll bring our expertise in what's working in PR and marketing. And our client team brings their knowledge of what's working in their organization. and together we come up with a really amazing plan. For many, it's been a transformative process. I have watched how teams have come together and their faces light up because they have such a sense of accomplishment and they're so excited about the future of their organization. We help our client figure out the best way to implement the plan, sometimes using people within their organization and sometimes with our help. We would love to chat with you about how you can expand your network and achieve your marketing goals with a Marshall Plan. Go to marshallpr.com/MarshallPlan to learn more about the process, or better yet, send me an email at nancy@prmaven.com and we'll set up a time to talk and get started. And now back to our conversation. Welcome back, and let's dive right back into our list of podcasting tips for how to be a great podcast guest. I'm here with Greg Glynn from Marshall Communications, who's producer of the PR Maven Podcast. And Greg, is it important to have good equipment for your podcast?
Absolutely. So this is something that we realized early on with the PR Maven podcast, where we were recording it actually at Marshall Communications in our office. And what we were realizing was that sometimes we would do an interview with a guest that was not able to be in our studio, and they would call in through a cell phone. And if we had a lower bandwidth that day, let's say there were a lot of people in the area that were using up the internet, you can actually slow down the speed so much so that it can interrupt calls. It can have drop calls. You may have lawnmowers outside on Tuesday afternoons. It can be a lot of different things going on. Sirens are another good one. There's also even phone calls, loud noises in the office. You can get a lot of different things that impact the audio quality. And for podcasting, that's really important because guess what? At the end of the day, all you have is the audio. There's no visual component. So that means that 100% focus is on that audio. And really, in my mind, a big credit here to Tanner Campbell at the Portland Pod, where we now record.
Yay, Tanner!
Tanner!
Woo!
Tanner is not only a great producer, but he understands the value of equipment. And I think that that's really important. He has put up several panels here in this studio to diffuse a lot of the bouncing of the sound. He's put up things in the windows. You would never know that we're right off the side of the road, which is really important. You can get cars driving by like we're talking about with traffic, and you'll be able to hear that because audio picks up so much. You really have to have all the right equipment. That even means foam pieces on the tops of your microphones. It avoids some of the spit hitting the microphone, which causes more noise. So when you
spit, what? I would never do that. I'm a lady.
So it's really important to have the right equipment, not only in your studio, okay, but it's also important if you're the guest, because if you're the guest and you don't have the right equipment, let's say you are deciding you're going to take a podcast call while you are driving, and you all of a sudden are driving through an area you haven't driven through before where you don't realize you're going to drop your signal, or maybe you realize that you're on the road and you're in trouble because you're about ready to hit an area where you're going to lose signal. You should pull over as a guest. You don't want to drop a call. I also don't think you should be driving and conducting an interview. But the idea is, again, going back to our scheduling, make sure you're in an optimal situation. Preferably you're in a quiet environment, whether that's your office, your home office. Ideally, you're on a landline if you are calling in. There's also a lot of different apps that are being used right now. We use Ringer, for example, which is actually a great way to connect with a guest on their cell phone. But again, Ringer is only as good as the guest. So if you go travel somewhere and you drop your call, that's going to be a difficult challenge. But Ringer actually has an amazing program built into it so that it makes the cell phone not sound like a cell phone. It actually sounds like studio quality, which is really good. But also, if you get instructions, if you're supposed to have headphones on, if you're supposed to improve the quality with a certain type of microphone that they ask for, you've got to follow these instructions, because if they've given you these instructions, they're going to be able to tell that you didn't follow the instructions, and that's going to be really difficult and gets, again, the podcast off to a tough start when we have to ask a guest, we can hear a cat in the background. Can you please tell your cat to leave the room? I mean,
meow.
and we've seen it. We've heard it, and it's important to make sure you, again, are thinking about the best equipment that you can have to be a guest and also in your studio if you are recording.
Well, thanks. I totally agree. And I remember when I launched the PR Maven podcast, one of my clients, who is a bank president, said, just don't make one of those podcasts that hurts to listen to. And I've always remembered that. And actually, that's a big reason why I decided to start recording at the Portland Pod, is because I wanted the quality of the audio to reflect the PR Maven brand and the Marshall Communications brand. So it's worth making an investment.
And you can totally tell when you listen to podcasts whether or not they're in a studio or not. And as podcasting evolves, we're going to start to see a lot more, hopefully, quality audio. And I think it's going to really weed out some of those other podcasts because people are going to expect a higher amount of quality.
Right, exactly. So what can guests do on the day of the recording to make the process run more smoothly?
Perfect. So one of the things that I would suggest, and I talked about it earlier, is clear your day. No matter what time the podcast interview is, I think it's really important to have a clear head. Make sure you're prepared. Make sure you've gone over the notes. Make sure you've gone over the questions you're going to be asked so that you can be ready and be your best self. That's a line there from Olympian Julia Kluge. When we used to work with Julia and she would do her school presentation, she always wanted to be the best version of herself, and she would tell that to the students in the high schools. And I think that it's really important because you need to have a clear head. You don't want to be distracted by something, but there's other things that you need to be thinking about. And these can be physical as well as mental, but you also need to know how long the interview is going to be. So we've had situations, Nancy, where you'd be on a podcast and we knew that the interview was only going to be 5 to 10 minutes. And you, as the guest, need to go, okay, if I'm only going to have 5 to 10 minutes, I better think about what I want to say and make it really good in those 5 to 10 minutes. Versus if I say to you, oh, yeah, the podcast is like 60 to 75 minutes. Yeah, we'll have a good time. Oh, it goes by quickly. Then you know you got plenty of time. You can tell stories till the cows come home, till the bread is baked, whatever.
Right, I was just thinking that. I could talk about being the bread baking champion, being in the pony club and the church group, too.
There you go, see? And we haven't even heard those stories yet. So it's really important to know how long that interview is going to be so you can figure out where you're going to go with your storytelling or your level of expertise and what you want to talk about. I also think it's really important to be ready. So that means if they say they're going to call you at 10 a.m., you're ready at 9:30. You don't want to be messing around, and I know this sounds silly, but there are things physically that you can do to prepare to be on a podcast. Number one, drink lots of water. Water is really good for your voice. It will also help you, I think, just have a better day from a health perspective. It'll allow you to not, sometimes people will drink caffeinated beverages. It can actually end up making you burp a little bit more because of the carbonation. And then also things to think about too is making sure you get a good night's sleep the night before. That does matter. Again, you want to have a nice clear head and give yourself the best opportunity to succeed. And then also when you take the call, it's going to be that first interaction. In most cases, probably with the host, it might be the first time that you're interacting with them. So making sure that you take that call and you're ready, you're not in the bathroom. I mean, go to the bathroom, probably 15 minutes before you're about ready to go on, so to speak, so that you don't sit there during the interview going, oh my gosh, I have to go to the bathroom, I have to go to the bathroom. And all of a sudden, that's the only thing you're thinking about, right? So it's so important to be ready in all aspects of the interview so that nothing kind of takes you off your game.
And is there anything a guest should do following the recording or release of the episode?
Yeah, if you want to be a great podcast guest, here's what you do. You help the host promote the episode. There's no better way to get invited back on a podcast than to share the episode. Show them your influencer power. Show them that you're going to get so many likes on sharing the episode on social media. Promote the interview not only just on social media or on your website. Use all your communications channels. That means your e-newsletter. It could be a flash briefing that you record. It could be a separate print newsletter. It can be anything that you do and really get the word out. Because, again, at the end of the day, not only are you showing that host that you were on the podcast and you were appreciative and you really shared the episode, guess what that's going to do when another host gets pitched by you and they say, well, let's take a look at their Facebook page. And then all of a sudden they look at the Facebook page and they realize, wow, they've, number one, been on 10 podcasts in the last 2 months. That's pretty impressive. And they've also shared all of the content and all of the episodes. So yeah, we're going to get a big benefit out of having this person on because they're going to share it with their audience rather than someone who comes on. They don't treat it like a big deal. They don't even post about it. And the episode goes away, so to speak, in their world. We're trying to promote it. And we can't even get anybody to reciprocate, even the guests. So you've really got to promote it. You've got to go in knowing if I'm going to be on podcasts and I'm going to pitch myself or I want to do this, you've got some skin in the game too.
Well, and I mean, we have evidence of that because the number 1 and number 2 episodes of all time of the PR Maven podcast were with our friend Lieutenant Tim Cotton of the Bangor, Maine Police Department, who is a phenomenal Facebook poster. And he shared it with his gigantic audience. I think he has like several 100,000 fans and followers on Facebook. And, both times that he was on the show, and he received the Golden Microphone Award at our first anniversary podcast party. And
he had like this is how amazing it is. He had about 300 downloads in like the first 4 hours. It was amazing.
And a lot of people were thrilled because they had never heard the sound of his voice before. They had been reading his beautiful writing, but they were fascinated by how he sounded, which again is, a good example of how podcasting can bring someone to life.
Absolutely.
So, I'm so glad that I met Lieutenant Tim Cotton actually through a networking event in Portland, Maine, and then invited him to be on the podcast, and he was such a gracious guest. So that was fantastic. Well, PR Maven Nation, that wraps up this week's podcast. Thanks to Greg for joining us and sharing all of this great wisdom and knowledge about how to be a great podcast guest.
It's very important.
Yep. And I have been enjoying going on some other podcasts, and I'm going to be doing more of that in 2020 as I'm going to be doing more public speaking as well. So I'm finally coming out of my shell. It's taken many years, but finally, I think we should have a debutante ball for my coming out party. So if you have any questions for Greg or for me or any of our guests, feel free to email me at nancy@prmaven.com. And I just want to remind you that this podcast is presented by Marshall Communications, creator of the 65-step Marshall Plan strategic process. And to learn more about the Marshall Plan, visit marshallpr.com. And a reminder about Alexa, if you have an Alexa device, you can say, "Hey, Alexa, play the PR Maven podcast." And you can pick today's episode or any previous episode. And you can also enable the skill to receive the daily PR Maven podcast flash briefing with tips and advice from each episode. And I want to thank you again for tuning in to the PR Maven podcast. And remember, you can always learn more about how to use Alexa's features and subscribe to the podcast at prmaven.com/podcast. We certainly appreciate you listening and would ask that you share the podcast with at least one friend or family member or coworker. And please give us a good rating on your favorite podcast player. And remember to go out there in the world and build your relationships and embrace all the new technology that helps you to build your personal brand. Have a great week, PR Maven Nation. That's it for this week's episode. I'd like to thank you for listening, and if you feel that you've gotten value out of today's conversation, consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes or whatever app you're using to tune in. If you haven't subscribed yet, you should do so. I release a new episode each week, and subscribing will make sure you get an alert when there's a new episode. You can also join the PR Maven Nation by going to prmaven.com/nation and clicking join. It's free, and it's a great community of like-minded individuals who are all looking to learn and grow from one another. If you have an Alexa-enabled device, be sure to add the PR Maven Marketing Minute to your daily flash briefing menu. Thanks again for listening, and have a great rest of your week, PR Maven Nation.